Welcome to the Mongabay Newscast. I am your host, Mike DiGirolamo, bringing you the news and inspiration from nature's frontline. Filling in for your regular host, Mike Garecki. Joining us this week is a returning guest who is unfamiliar to few, but just in case you don't know him, Rhett Butler is Mongabay's founder and CEO who founded the organization in 1999. And he joins the newscast this week to give us an update on deforestation rates of the Brazilian Amazon, how it compares to years previous, the outlook going forward, and how the upcoming Brazilian presidential election in October could change this. He also shares his insight into a recently renewed REDD+ deal between Norway and Indonesia, where the former will pay the latter to keep forests standing. The details have yet to be determined, but the previous deal, which was terminated in 2021, was worth roughly $1 billion. Rhett also shares his insight into a recent trip to Peru. And just this past week, the European Parliament passed a bill to ban imports of deforestation-linked commodities into the European Union. Rhett shares his thoughts about this bill and what this means for forests moving forward. So, hi, Rhett. Welcome back to the podcast. How are things going with you? And I hear that you recently took a trip to Peru. Do you care to share about that with our audience?
Yeah, I'm doing well. I was in Peru, I guess it was in July. I was actually down there for a meeting at the Association for Tropical Biology and Conservation. Mongabay had a presence there, so we did a workshop for journalists and scientists. Then I moderated like a keynote session, and we had a few members from the Mongabay LATAM team. So that was the main purpose of the trip. But as an add-on, I went down to Peru for a few days and went out to the field. So specifically, I went to Madre de Dios. So I went from Cusco over the Andes down into the Amazon lowlands. And I took some drone footage and looked into some deforestation alerts.
And so what did you find out from this monitoring and the deforestation alerts that you saw down in Peru?
Yeah, so it was really interesting. So this area has traditionally had a pretty low deforestation rate. But when I looked at the satellite data, there was a lot of pink areas, which are representative of deforestation, happening basically in 2021. And so I was very keen to see what was happening on the ground. And so using the drone, we flew over some of these areas to see what was going on. And there's a lot of clearing going on. The primary factors seem to be coca. So there's a lot more coca production, which is used for cocaine. And so a lot of this coca is then going into Bolivia, I was told, or even Colombia. So there's these clandestine airstrips that have been set up. And so the coca is produced here and then it's ferried out of the country to be turned into cocaine. And so one of the reasons there's been a boom in this is there's been a reduction in law enforcement with the pandemic. So Peru was, I think, the hardest hit country in the world by COVID in terms of the number of people who died on a per capita basis from COVID. And so the government really focused on dealing with this crisis and not so much on law enforcement or monitoring what was going on. And so there was this big increase in the coca production across Peru, including in this region. So the other factor is a lot of people left the cities during the pandemic and went back to the countryside where they may have come from and started growing food. And so there's been an increase in agriculture as well. And so that's probably a secondary factor, is kind of this reverse migration from urban areas to rural areas. And so again, if you look at the data, it's, year to year, it's pretty flat. And then all of a sudden in 2021, there's this big spike. And so, it was interesting to observe that firsthand. I traveled with a Mongabay LATAM journalist who will be developing a story. And then I captured about a bunch of footage of that. So beyond the deforestation alerts, I got some really nice imagery using the drone of landscapes that are still intact and not being cleared that I think will be, quite useful for Mongabay stories and, Mongabay videos as well.
So it appears that this year is on pace to be a near record year for Amazon deforestation. What is the current record, and why are we so close to matching it?
So that's it's near a record because the record for this data set only goes back to 2006. So it's near the highest level that's been recorded in that interval. Before that record started, deforestation was higher. So it's a relatively short time frame. It's, 15, 16 years. But essentially the record that we're talking about here is, using a deforestation alert data that comes both from the Brazilian government, but also independent monitoring by an NGO, known as Amazon. And so both those systems are showing that, this alert-based deforestation monitoring system has detected, unusually high levels of deforestation. And so people who've been observing the situation in the Amazon, it's not really surprising. There've been a lot of fires, and it's very clear that, there's a lot of forest clearing going on. And so that's the record that we're talking about. And so last year, when the final numbers were tallied, which typically happens in October or November, it showed that deforestation topped 13,000 square kilometers, for the first time since 2006. So if we look at the alert-based data that came out before that, that kind of final number, it's very similar to where the deforestation alert data is this year. So that suggests that, when the final numbers come in, that, we should expect to see a very high deforestation rate for the past 12 months.
So can you talk about what has contributed to or enabled such a high amount of deforestation, particularly since Jair Bolsonaro took office?
So deforestation has increased by about 60 to 70% on an annual rate, since Bolsonaro took office relative to the baseline before that. And it's not really surprising given, what Bolsonaro, campaigned on. He's employed a lot of anti-environmental rhetoric when he was doing his campaign, but also since he took office. But he's also kind of followed through on that rhetoric by, not creating any new protected areas, even reducing some protected areas and allowing activities in protected areas in indigenous lands that weren't previously allowed. He's kind of granted amnesty for past illegal deforestation. Environmental law enforcement has been greatly reduced. And he's used messaging that's, you could argue has actively encouraged deforestation. And so all those have contributed to this rise that we've seen, the past 3+ years.
So let's talk about the consequences of this increase, especially now that scientists and indigenous organizations are saying that, we may have already passed a tipping point where vast swaths of the rainforest may no longer recover and savanization could take over. Can you talk about these tipping points? Have we crossed them? Is there a tipping point that we have yet to reach?
So scientists have theorized that there's a tipping point in the Amazon of anywhere between 20 and 30% generally, where if we cross that threshold, then large parts of the Amazon, they would tip more towards this drier savanna-like ecosystem. So more like a tropical woodland than a tropical rainforest. So in terms of how much of the Amazon's been destroyed, there are various estimates on this front, but it's typically between 13 and 18% is, the number that's put around. But that high level number doesn't tell the full picture. So if we divide the Amazon up, especially the Brazilian Amazon, where most of the deforestation has happened has been, in the eastern parts of the Amazon and southern parts of the Amazon. So sort of the southeastern part of the basin and then the southern part of the basin. So in that part of the Amazon, the amount of forest clearing is over 30%. And so if we, kind of zoom in there, that's the region that's most likely to be a tipping point. And there's been data that's, been published in the past few years, which has shown that parts of the ecosystem are already transitioning towards a drier habitat. So that means some of the Cerrado and dry forest species, tree species are showing up in that region. There's a greater incidence and recurrence of fire, and there's more tree die-off. And so it's probably most helpful to think about tipping points in the Amazon, at least at this point, as being regional. Whereas, if we look at the Western Amazon, which is much more intact, there are less signs of sort of this tipping point. Big picture is scientists see the Amazon as being approaching a tipping point, but parts of the Amazon are a much higher risk of tipping than the entire ecosystem at this point in time.
So As we all know, we have an election coming up, specifically the Brazilian presidential election, and it seems like the polls indicate there's a decent chance that this could go to a runoff between incumbent Jair Bolsonaro and former Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva in what is being described as an election that will decide the fate of the Amazon rainforest. Can you explain to us how and why this election is so consequential?
These two candidates have radically different approaches to the Amazon. Under Lula, there was this historic drop in deforestation. So when he took office, deforestation was pretty much at a peak. I mean, it was 27,000 square kilometers, I believe, in 2004. And by the time he left office, it was down by more than 3/4 from that number. So Brazilian government policy played a big role in that drop in deforestation. So the government implemented this program, which is a little bit, the name's a little bit cumbersome, but in English, it's the Action Plan for the Prevention and Control of Deforestation in the Legal Amazon. And so there are multiple components to that program that included creating financial incentives for companies to not deforest, but also landholders to join a registry to essentially get better control of deforestation. So farmers could get access to lower interest loans, for example, if they didn't deforest beyond what was legally allowed. Another really important part of this program was monitoring. Under this program, Brazil developed basically the world's leading deforestation monitoring system. And so what that did is it allowed authorities to see where deforestation was happening. And so there's the political will to actually take action. It meant that they could go after deforestation essentially as it was occurring. And so that was a huge contributor to this drop in deforestation. And then, the second part of that monitoring was obviously the enforcement side. And so under Lula, there was stepped up law enforcement. So, going after, people who were, doing illegal deforestation. So under Bolsonaro, it's been very different. So, one of the first things Bolsonaro did was he froze, payments from the Amazon fund. The money for that primarily came from the Norwegian and German governments. And a lot of that was used for supporting, conservation programs in the Amazon. So that was frozen. Since he's been in power, no new indigenous territories or protected areas have been established. His administration has hollowed out a lot of the bureaucracies and agencies that are tasked with protecting the Amazon and managing natural resources. So that typically means like replacing scientists with cronies. Law enforcement's been reduced. So like budgets for IBAMA, which is Environmental Enforcement Agency, has been slashed quite dramatically. And then there's been amnesty granted for illegal deforestation. And so all of these things are contributing to this increase in deforestation. The other thing that we've already talked about is the rhetoric. And so, Bolsonaro continues to use very heated rhetoric against environmentalists, indigenous peoples, and scientists. Since he's been in power, there's been this big surge in violence against indigenous defenders and environmentalists and journalists. So, these things kind of go hand in hand.
So if Lula is elected or rather reelected, what are the prospects going forward? Is there hope of staying under some of these devastating tipping points?
So Lula has campaigned around the idea of protecting the Amazon. So it's a very central part of the pitch he's making to the Brazilian public. In terms of tipping points, I mean, I think that's getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. But, the main point is that Lula has a history of implementing this program to reduce deforestation, and he's campaigning on the idea of protecting the Amazon. So it's a much more favorable policy and political environment than what Bolsonaro is putting forth. And so I would say the chances of avoiding a tipping point are better under Lula than under Bolsonaro.
So we're going to shift gears a little bit. Let's talk about the Rhett plus carbon deal between Norway and Indonesia. But before we detail it, can you explain to our audience what Rhett plus is?
So Rhett plus is this concept of reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. And the plus refers to other activities as well. So that's the general concept. There's a whole bunch of, variations on what Rhett plus is, but that's, conceptually the framework. And so, at the government level, what happened was Norway committed $1 billion to Indonesia if Indonesia reduces deforestation below a baseline. So essentially, Norway would pay for emissions reductions from reducing deforestation and degradation in Indonesia.
And why was this deal canceled?
This deal was canceled by the Indonesian government, I believe last year, due to lack of payment. And so the deforestation rate in Indonesia has been falling since 2015. And the Norwegian government has been slow to pay Indonesia for those reductions in deforestation. So there's all sorts of reasons for why it's slow, but in a political context, it didn't look great for Indonesia to achieve these reductions in deforestation and not get paid for it. And so it was sort of politically untenable for Indonesia to maintain this relationship or this deal if it wasn't getting paid for what it said it would do.
Why was it renewed?
Well, this deal was renewed, I think, because it looked pretty bad that Norway hadn't paid Indonesia. It set sort of a bad precedent. And so when this whole thing was conceived, more than a decade ago, it was seen as being a very landmark commitment to reducing deforestation. So here you had this wealthy government supporting forest conservation in a country with a high deforestation rate. And $1 billion is a big round number. So it seemed like a very meaningful commitment. That being said, $1 billion relative to how much money is generated from forestry and agribusiness in Indonesia isn't huge, but it was more of a gesture and that was important. And so, fast forward, several years and the payments aren't being made. It just kind of looks bad for the whole idea of the commitment. And so, I think that Norway and Indonesia, I think Norway particularly wanted to have this deal work. And so they went back to the table and met with Indonesia, and now it's been re-upped. And Norway is committed to paying for that deforestation that's been, those deforestation reductions that have already happened. And so I would say it's a very positive sign of re-engagement between these two governments in efforts to reduce deforestation.
And so other than that, what about this time is different than the last time that the agreement was struck? And is there any indication that it has a better outlook?
So what's different this time is deforestation's fallen now by about 90% on an annual basis if we look at just last year compared to 2015. So there's kind of this track record or trend of declining deforestation in Indonesia, which I think has surprised a lot of people. There are a lot of questions as to whether it's going to continue because of some of the macroeconomic trends, especially these higher commodity prices. So, palm oil is very high right now. All sorts of commodities that are produced on forest lands are very high. So that's going to create a lot of pressure for deforestation to increase. And so it's actually a really critical time for these conservation funds to be available in Indonesia. In terms of, what will happen the next few years, that's a big question. I have no idea. There is certainly a lot of pressure for deforestation to go higher based on, these macroeconomic trends and some of the policies that were adopted in Indonesia during the pandemic. But so far, there aren't signs that deforestation is actually rising. So that's at least positive in forest conservation terms.
So at the start of this year, you told listeners to kind of keep an eye out on a few things to watch for as this year goes on. And so we're going to touch upon some of those right now. You previously mentioned on the newscast that there was an increase in proposed legislation around restricting products derived from illegal deforestation in 2021. Did anything happen so far in 2022 to move that forward, such as the European Union lawmakers backing a proposal to ban the sale of agricultural products linked to deforestation?
So that's really the big one. And so that happened this week. The European Parliament voted quite overwhelmingly in support of this bill to essentially block imports of commodities that are linked with deforestation. So now the burden of proving that a product isn't linked to deforestation is on the buyers. And so when this bill was kind of going through the process late last year, it only applied to, I believe it was 6 commodities, but now it's been expanded to 14 commodities. It also last year was focused just on forests, but now it's been brought in to include other ecosystems as well. And there are human rights and indigenous rights and other sort of social safeguards that are built into it. So it's become much broader in scope, yet it's still passed overwhelmingly. So this is a big deal because the European Union is the third largest importer of these commodities in the world.
And do you think the United States could do something or follow suit in a similar piece of legislation?
So whether the United States will follow is an interesting question. Some states have put forth bills that are similar. Like California had one earlier this year that did not pass. It didn't even get a vote. So there's certainly conversations about it, but I'm not aware of much forward progress in terms of something becoming a law. And so currently, right now, most of the discussion in the United States is around legality, rather than deforestation itself. And so one of the things that sets the EU bill, kind of apart is just talking generally about deforestation, whether it's legal or not legal. And that's important because a lot of deforestation is legal. And so removing that question of legality essentially increases the scope of the regulation.
So this piece of legislation sounds pretty promising. Are there any downsides to it?
Yeah, I mean, so it's definitely promising in terms of forest conservation. You know, one of I guess the elephant in the room is that the EU is not the biggest market for most commodities that drive deforestation, and it's becoming less important kind of by the day as other markets like China consume more of these products. That's one limitation. You know, that being said, it does increase the scrutiny of supply chains and will create a lot more investment in monitoring, whether that's via satellite or other platforms. And so it kind of like makes it easier for other governments to then pass similar laws or for these practices just kind of get baked into how companies do business. So that's very positive. The other sort of, I guess, risk or downside from this is it will be harder for small businesses, but also small farmers to be in compliance with this. So it's one thing for like a Unilever or a Nestle or like Cargill to deal with this regulation. I mean, they've got a lot of resources, but for like a small farmer in Sumatra, you know, it locks them out of a market. And so, I mean, it does help address the deforestation, but if we're talking about like social equity and justice, things like that, there are some things that need to be dealt with because it is easier for big companies to comply with this than small businesses and these smallholders. And then what I've already mentioned is that it doesn't distinguish between illegal and legal deforestation. And so there are sovereignty issues that will come up, like Brazil will say that we allowed deforestation. So, you know, why are you imposing this rule on us? You know, landowners in the Amazon are allowed to clear 20% of their land. And so the products they produce from that deforestation should be allowed. And so there's just kind of like setting up these battles that will occur. But overall, I would say it's very favorable for efforts to address deforestation globally.
So for entities outside the EU that are trying to track the sustainability of commodities, does this change the conversation for them?
Yeah, I think it does because it creates this huge incentive to understand where your commodities are coming from and the supplies that go into the products that you make. And so it's going to create more of a market and through this legal incentive to develop tracking systems, monitoring systems around commodity supply chains to manage that risk. And so, you know, typically what happens is there'll be a lot more investment in this space. The services and products will get better, more available and more accessible. And so, you know, I would expect this to be a real boon for, you know, like satellite tracking companies that track, you know, changes in forest cover via satellite, you know, like RFID technologies that can see where things are moving through supply chains. You know, even blockchain will probably benefit from this because companies will put, you know, commodities, in blockchain registries to, you know, so people can see where these products are coming from.
Are there any Mongabay projects or stories or investigations coming up that you want people to keep an eye out for?
Yeah, we have a couple big investigations that we're working on for a long time that are dropping in the next few weeks. So I can't give away too many details, but one is dealing with a certain commodity in the Amazon, some illegal activity around that. And then the other is around shark finning. And so then again, these are investigations that have taken a lot of time and resources, but I think will be very interesting, once they're released. And we'll be partnering with some other media outlets to get that information out there. The other thing I guess I would highlight is we are about to announce the first cohort of fellows under this new fellowship program. They will be announced in early October. We had an incredible pool of applicants, and I've been told by the team that it's been really hard to sort of choose the final members of the cohort. But there was clearly a lot of interest in this program, and it's just really great to see these young and aspiring journalists who will be in the program and doing some stories for Mongabay.
That's exciting to hear. Rhett, thank you so much for joining us today.
Great. Well, thank you for having me.
You can read more on Mongabay's recent reporting on the near-record high pace of Amazon deforestation by clicking the links provided in the show notes or reading Mongabay's series Amazon Conservation. Make sure to keep an eye out for our upcoming coverage of the Brazilian presidential election. And you can also check out our reporting on the renewal of Indonesia's REDD Plus deal with Norway, written by Hans Nicholas Young, linked in the show notes. As always, if you enjoy the Mongabay newscast, we also ask that you please help spread the word by telling a friend. That is the best way to help expand our reach and keep growing. You can also support us by becoming a monthly sponsor via our Patreon page at patreon.com/Mongabay. We are a non-profit news outlet, so even just $1 per month will really help us offset the production costs and hosting fees. So if you're a fan of our audio reports from Nature's Frontline, head to patreon.com/Mongabay to learn more and support the Mongabay newscast. That's patreon.com/Mongabay. You and your friends can join the listeners who have downloaded the Mongabay newscast nearly 500,000 times by subscribing to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts from, or you can download our app for Apple and Android devices. Just search either app store for the Mongabay newscast app to gain fingertip access to new shows and all our previous episodes. And yes, you can always read our news and inspiration from Nature's Frontline at mongabay.com. Or if you prefer to keep up with us on social media, follow us at facebook.com/Mongabay or on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, where our handle is @Mongabay on all platforms. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.